highlighting the story because it's actually like chapter 27 through 33. So I will tell you the story. It's a story you may be familiar with, but it's the story of Esau and Jacob. So Esau and Jacob were Isaac's sons. Esau was the firstborn. They were twins. And Esau was born first, and he was covered with hair. And Jacob was hooked onto his heel as he was pulled out. And they grew and were very different. Jacob's name means deceiver. And he kind of lived up to that because when they were grown men, Jacob convinced Esau to give away his birthright over some stew. He was hungry and he took advantage of that. Giving away your birthright is kind of giving away your standing in the community. And then a little bit later on, with the influence of his mother, Rebecca, who really liked Jacob more than she liked Esau, and they say Isaac liked Esau better. They tricked Isaac, because he was blind, into giving away his blessing. Now, in Hebrew families or Israelite families, when the father gave away the blessing, he could only give it once. It was you received part of, you got animals and assets and blessing, which was standing in the family. And so Jacob put on animal skins so that when his dad touched him, he would feel the hair and think it was Esau. And he disguised his voice, and he brought food in to him, and he tricked Isaac, and Isaac gave him his blessing. Well, you can imagine that Esau, when he found out, was livid and threatened to kill Jacob. And it's heart-wrenching if you read in the text where Esau is begging his father, "Don't you have another blessing for me, Father? Don't you have another blessing?" How many of us want a blessing from our fathers, our earthly fathers, and what it can do to us if we don't get that blessing? So, let's see. Let me get back to it. That's in 27. So, he says, "Have you only one blessing, Father? Bless me also, Father." And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. And Isaac did not have another blessing to give, because in the rules of the way the families were hierarchical and the way they lived, you only gave it once and it couldn't be rescinded. So at that point, Jacob hears that Esau's mad, and his mother says, "You better go. You better leave, because he's going to kill you. Go into the desert, go to this part of the country where my brother Laban will take you on, and you'll be safe." So that's where we start. And we're going to look at how these two guys were reconciled. Think about maybe a family situation that seems like there could never be reconciliation. I mean, if you want to look at one, I don't see in this worldly view that there could ever be reconciliation between Esau and Jacob. I mean, I've met people in their families who have splits and divisions that are as serious as this, and it seems hopeless. So when we talk about reconciliation from the Bible's perspective, it's a process of two previously alienated parties coming to peace with each other. Now, God does that for us in that we are reconciled to Him through Jesus. Why are we at odds with Jesus? Why are we apart from Jesus? Who can tell me? because of sin. And so we need something to bring us back into relationship, and that's Jesus who provides us with that pathway to be reconciled. And so Jesus then tells us that we are ambassadors for Christ, and our job is to reconcile people. Now, that doesn't mean that we're mats for people to walk on, but that in situations we have to prayerfully consider, how do we be reconcilers in this situation? Instead of dividers or continuing to exacerbate the problem. But here is the really, really crux of the issue, is that reconciliation begins with God. So in chapter 32, at the very beginning, after Jacob has fled, it says, Jacob went on his way, and the angels of him, and when Jacob saw them, he said, this is God's camp. So he called that place Mahanaim. After Jacob met the angels there, immediately he sent a messenger to his brother Esau, instructing them to tell him this. Thus you shall say to my lord Esau, thus says your servant Jacob, I have lived with Laban as an alien and stayed until now. And I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male and female slaves, and I have sent to tell my lord in order that I may find favor in your sight. So all that to say, Jacob has an encounter with an angel, with God in the camp, and he comes out realizing he needs to make an overture to Esau. So he reaches out through a messenger and sends a herd of animals, some people to be given to him because he is concerned that he wants to win favor of his brother. Now, I gotta say, I think also fear played a role in this. I think he was still afraid. So he's still human. Sometimes we pray and we know we do the right thing because we're afraid of the outcome. But I think also he realized that he wanted to be reconciled. So reconciliation starts with God prompting us in our hearts that we need to be reconciled. And then, this is really big, you guys. Before we can be completely reconciled with God, we've got to be reconciled with humans. What do I mean by that? Well, let me tell you what it says in Matthew. It says in Matthew 5, so if you're offering your gift on the altar, and there you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. Go and be reconciled with your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Before you come to worship, before you come to the communion table, before you come to God, God directs us to make things right with our brothers and sisters. Because, why? If we don't, it's like a wedge driven between our relationship with God. It's a hindrance. And so you wonder, well, I just don't get anything out of worship. There's a chance that it's because you haven't gone to your brother or your sister and tried to reconcile. Could it be? It's worth a thought because it says here in Matthew. And then he goes on to say in Matthew again, 18, if your brother sins against you, go and rebuke him in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. So just between the two of them, you deal with it. Now, that doesn't mean that you have a guarantee that the other human being is going to reconcile. You can't be responsible for the other person's reconciliation. They have to do that. But you, in humility, can, keep your nose clean, so to speak, take care of your business, and then the rest is up to God and up to them and whether they listen. So it starts with God, and then it means that to be reconciled with God, we have to be reconciled with one another. And it has to be intentional. So Jacob knew I think, that he'd done wrong, and he knew that he had to be the first one to take the step to make it right. And so that's why he sent the peace offering, so to speak. You know, when we have a cracked relationship with somebody, it's kind of like having a broken arm. You go to the doctor, and the doctor sets it, puts it right, puts a cast on it so that the healing can take place. Broken relationships, like broken arms, are never mended accidentally. They require purposeful and intentional action. Maybe you've had a broken relationship and you've had to make action. You've had to do something to mend that. Things don't generally mend accidentally. There's usually got to be somebody who takes the first step. We may try to deny the pain or ignore the splint. We may think that time heals all wounds, but it only moves the pain to the surface unless it is set and cast. And you've seen it in families that broken relationships affect future relationships. They affect how other people relate in a family system. If you're not in good relationship with somebody, it affects your children, their children. It is God's desire for us that we would be the initiator in reconciling and be intentional in doing that. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. And so the same principle is true in reconciling relationships. The shortest distance between two people is to just go straight to the person and say, I was wrong, or I haven't been honest with you, or your actions hurt me. I love you too much for our relationship to crumble. Or if you don't really understand who started it, or sometimes we get into these long-term problems in relationships and we can't even remember how they started. And so help me understand. If you make statements, help me understand how we can be okay again. Help me understand what you need and how we can mend this relationship. So it also has to be bathed in prayer. Right before, my favorite passages, 32, starting with chapter 9, is where Jacob wrestles with the angel or God at Peniel. In chapter 32, starting with 22. This is right before he is met with Esau for the first time since they had their problem when he did that terrible thing to him. So it's interesting that he had this encounter, this prayer encounter, and he came out changed. And I think this was part of the reason why he was able to be so humble. So let me read part of this. The night before, he got up. He had his maids and his children and his wives, and he crossed the ford of the Jabbok River. And he was left alone for a time, and it says a man wrestled him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of the joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go until you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." And when he woke up, he was limping because of his hip. And that is why the Israelites to this day do not eat the thigh muscle on the hip socket of any animal. They remember Jacob's encounter with God. The man was God or an angel or God's spirit, and he was wrestling with him, and God was in one sense, creating humility in Jacob. And Jacob fought back, and God did not let him go. God did not let up. And Jacob came out of that wrestling with a limp, a permanent limp. You don't have an encounter with God without being changed. And so for the rest of Jacob's life, he limped, and he was reminded of that encounter of God, of the forgiveness that he had been given for what he did, and in spite of his past, what the future held for Jacob, because God was going to continue to grow and build this nation from his descendants, and he would be called Israel from that time forth. And it's interesting that as soon as Jacob woke up that next morning, he met Esau. God can soften our hearts. God can soften the most bitter callus that we might hold on our hearts, even if we've been totally done wrong. God can make it better. God can be like an ointment, a balm in Gilead, and even give you compassion towards the one that has hurt you. Imagine that you come out of this wrestling with God with compassion. So, reconciliation demands humility. How do we know that he was humble? Jacob looked up and saw Esau coming with all of his folks, and he went ahead of them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times. Jacob did 7 times, bowing himself to the ground until he came near his brother. And all of his wives and servants were bowed. Big deal, this whole 7 times bowing. This was a very humble thing to do. And you know what Esau did? God love him. He ran to meet and embraced Jacob and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. 33 verse 4. When Esau looked up and saw the women and children, he said, "Who are these with you?" And Jacob introduced all of them. And he told them that he had brought these animals and these servants to give to him, and Esau, "Oh, no, I'm not going to take him." But Jacob pressed and says, yes. And so Esau allowed him to pay restitution. Had you ever thought about that before? That reconciliation, insofar as you are able, also requires restitution. The paying back of what is lost if you're able. Now, Isaac could not give him back. Jacob, Israel, could not give Esau back the birthright or the blessing. But he gave what he was most able to give. He gave him assets, animals, important items, and people that were going to be servants, which it was kind of what they did in that day. It's a whole other sermon. Wives. Restitution. Interesting thought. You could preach a whole sermon about restitution. What is it that you do? And it was a gracious thing for Esau to allow Jacob to pay restitution. Esau had actually done really well for himself, and he had a lot of livestock, and he had many wives. He didn't need what Jacob was offering him, but he allowed it to happen. That was gracious. That was graceful. He allowed him to pay restitution. And it's interesting, there's one verse where Esau says, or Jacob says, "When I look at you, I see the face of God." When I look at you, he sees forgiveness. He sees what being reconciled to him looks like. I thought that was a really interesting thing. And I wonder if when they were embraced and crying, if Jacob said, brother, please forgive me. And Esau said, brother, I forgive you. I think that was whispered. So after reconciliation, there's forgiveness, and then there's restitution. Now, what if there's not forgiveness? Can you still do restitution? Yes, I think to a certain degree. It may not be received. It may not be received. But all you can do is offer. And that's why I like Esau. We kind of give Esau, we don't give him enough credit that he allowed restitution. He allowed forgiveness. So in this story, we see what reconciliation means. And it's actually 33:10 where Esau says, what Jacob says to Esau, for indeed I have seen your face, and it is like seeing God's face, since you have accepted me. 33:10, it is like God's face, since you have accepted me. If you want to know what God looks like, go to your brother or sister you've offended, ask their forgiveness, and hear them say, you are forgiven. Think about it. When we're in a bad relationship with God and we have to go and ask him for forgiveness, he doesn't hold a grudge. He doesn't punish us in eternity if we ask for forgiveness. He says, you are forgiven. And he embraces us like that brother or sister. I do not hold your sins against you. There's a verse, I don't know where it is in the Old Testament, but it says that his sins were forgiven and thrown into the ocean of forgetfulness, sea of forgetfulness, as far as the east is from the west. I don't know where that is. I'll find it for next week. And that when we raise up sins that we've been forgiven for, God says, what sins are you talking about? They've been cast into the sea of forgiveness. Just like that reconciliation door, what would have happened if that guy hadn't have used an axe, made a hole, stuck his hand out? He chanced it. The guy could have chopped his hand off, but he didn't. Oftentimes, our pride is what's holding us back from reconciling. And if somebody will be the initiator, all the bad vibes fall away, the tears can come, and reconciliation happens. That's where my heart and mind has been this week. Where do we need to find reconciliation? And is reconciliation hindering your walk? That's a question for you to ask yourself today. We're going to sing a song, and this is our invitation hymn, I Surrender All, 366. Come forward if you need to make a decision, have prayer, recommit your life, and then we'll take the Lord's Supper together.